Imagine hitting a breaking point at a toxic job. You ask for an immediate exit, a sudden rescue. Instead, you receive a season of quiet endurance. This creates a disorienting gap. You asked for a clean break, but received a prolonged struggle. The supposed fix looks like the opposite of a solution. Why does the rescue we ask for rarely match the reality we are handed? This modern frustration mirrors the core tension of the most misunderstood week in history. 2,000 years ago, Jerusalem's dirt roads vibrated with Passover energy. Thousands of travelers were packed tightly against the city walls, carrying a desperate anticipation. As Jesus of Nazareth approached, they began shouting a specific Hebrew word, Hosanna. We treat it like joyful praise today, but in the first century, it was a demand. It translates literally to, save us right now. These were an occupied people under the thumb of the Roman Empire. When they demanded salvation, they meant military liberation. They wanted a commander to break the occupation and put them back in power. Ancient monarchs had standard messaging. A king on a heavy Roman war horse signaled military conquest. Jesus deliberately chose a donkey, a symbol of peace. By doing this, he fulfilled Zechariah's prophecy, signaling a kingship built on peace rather than destruction. The crowd entirely missed the visual sermon. They looked at a humble servant and projected their own desire for a political conqueror right over him. They demanded a quick detour around their Roman problem. Jesus, however, was launching a rescue operation that required walking directly through the center of suffering. There was a massive discrepancy in scale between what the people wanted and what was happening. The crowd wanted to overthrow a temporary local government. Jesus was targeting an older, permanent enemy, the power of sin and death. To execute this, he operated through typology. This is when historical events act as a preview for a much larger reality. Jesus was claiming two separate historical roles simultaneously. On the left, a descending line from the ancient king claims the royal throne. On the right, a timeline shows him entering the gates exactly as Passover lambs are prepared for slaughter, presenting himself as the ultimate sacrifice. These conflicting identities, the ruling monarch and the bleeding lamb, collide on a Roman cross. This execution shattered the earthly expectations a crowd had built up. For anyone banking on a political fixer, Good Friday looked like a failure. Their supposed liberator was dead. The cross was the cost of curing the root disease of sin and death. It traded a temporary change in government for a permanent change in eternity. 3 days later, the chaos of the execution gave way to the silence of an ancient garden. When women arrived at the tomb, they found it empty, greeted only by angels who asked a piercing question: "Why do you look for the living among the dead?" A living Jesus walking out of a grave validates that his radical, sacrificial strategy was successful. The Apostle Paul outlines the mechanics of this victory in 1 Corinthians 15, using an agricultural term, first fruits. This flowchart illustrates how it works. A first fruit is the very first piece of a crop dedicated to God, guaranteeing that a massive harvest of the same crop is right behind it. Because Jesus conquered the grave first, he guarantees that his victory over death will spread to everyone who follows him. The crowd shouted Hosanna for a quick political fix. They received an eternal solution that rendered their initial demands obsolete. Which brings us back to the reality of an unanswered prayer or a toxic situation that refuses to resolve. When you scream, "Save me right now," and heaven seems silent, you are standing in the same tension as the crowds in Jerusalem. A delayed rescue or a season of heavy endurance is evidence that God is operating on a much larger timeline than you are. The king who bypassed a temporary throne to bleed on a cross is active right now. His no to an immediate demand is a yes to an eternal victory.